The first timber was a promise and a burden. It was 14 feet long, a laminate of 3 green ash boards he had steamed and bent over a custom form for 2 weeks, and it weighed nearly 100 pounds. Elias Thorne, all of 19 years and 150 pounds himself, hoisted it onto his shoulder, the rough wood biting into the worn fabric of his father's coat. He grunted, a sound absorbed by the vast gray Dakota sky of late October. Each step up the winding path to the abandoned silver mine was a deliberate, measured act. His boots slipped on loose shale, and the muscles in his back screamed a tight, hot protest. Beside him, a scruffy brown dog named Buster trotted with a quiet anxiety, his tail low, his intelligent eyes fixed on Elias's straining form. The dog offered no bark, only a steady, watchful presence. It was enough. He reached the dark maw of the mine, a scar of human ambition gouged into the hillside overlooking the small, hopeful town of Providence. He lowered the curved timber carefully to the ground, its arc a perfect, gentle crescent against the flat, dusty earth. He knelt, pulling a leather-bound journal from his satchel. The pages were filled with his father's precise, angular script and detailed ink drawings. Stress calculations, temperature charts, cross-sections of rock and soil. This one timber was the first rib of a skeleton, the beginning of a structure his father had conceived but never built. A small, arched house, a Quonset of wood and iron, built not on the land, but in it, nestled 30 feet inside the mine's entrance. A voice, gravelly with age and skepticism, cut through the wind. "What in God's name are you building, boy? A coffin for a giant?" Elias looked up. Jedediah Stone, a man who had mined this very hill for 20 years, stood on the path below, his hands on his hips, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and disbelief. He had known Elias's father, had respected his engineering mind, but always called his more esoteric ideas scholar's folly. Elias closed the journal and stood. "A house," he said, his voice quiet. Jed climbed the rest of the way, kicking a loose rock. He gestured with a thumb toward the mine. "A house? In there? Son, that's a tomb. The damp will get in your bones by Christmas. The rock groans in the deep cold. Your father filled pages with ideas like this, but he had the sense to live in a proper cabin with a stone hearth, same as the rest of us." "The earth stays at a constant temperature," Elias said, echoing a line from the journal. "Below the frost line." "The frost line is 10 feet down in a bad winter," Jed scoffed, a dry, rattling sound. "And what's that flimsy thing for? Wait until a proper blizzard hits. The wind up here will peel that thing open like a tin can. You listen to me, Elias. Your father was a good man, but he spent too much time with books and not enough with a shovel. This is a mistake." Elias offered no argument. He simply turned back to the timber, running his hand along its smooth, curved surface. He had a plan. He would prove it with action, not words. Jed watched him for another minute, shook his head, and walked away, muttering about the stubbornness of youth. Later that week, at Henderson's Mercantile, the sentiment was the same. Elias counted out coins for a keg of nails and 3 rolls of tar paper. Mr. Henderson, a man whose prosperity was built on the sound, predictable needs of the town, leaned on the counter. His face was stern, but his eyes held a flicker of paternal concern. "Jed tells me you're building some kind of shed inside the old Thorne mine," he said, his voice low. "It'll be warm," Elias replied, pocketing the change. "It'll be a death trap," Henderson countered, his voice rising slightly. "You're wasting the last of your father's money on this folly. I knew him, Elias. Brilliant man. But he didn't understand this land. It's not a page in a book you can reason with. It's a beast. And it's a beast that hasn't been truly angry in a decade. What happens when the snows come? Not the pleasant dustings we've had, but a real Dakota blizzard that buries doors and collapses roofs. What happens then? From behind the counter, Henderson's daughter, Anna, watched them. She was stacking tins of peaches, her movements quiet and efficient. She didn't share her father's dismissive tone. Her gaze was curious, analytical. She had seen Elias with his journal, seen the quiet intensity in his eyes. It was not the look of a fool. Elias met Mr. Henderson's gaze. "I'll be ready," he said. It was a simple, declarative statement. He hoisted the heavy supplies and walked out, the bell above the door jangling his departure into the cold, thin air. The work was a meditation. It was a conversation with his father, conducted through the language of wood, iron, and sweat. November arrived, and with it a deeper, more menacing chill that clung to the shadows. Each morning, Elias rose before dawn, ate a cold biscuit, and made the climb to the mine. Buster was always at his side, a silent partner in the immense undertaking. He spent the first 2 weeks finishing the ribs. He had felled the ash trees himself, milled them into planks with a rented pit saw, and then began the slow, arduous process of lamination and bending. He built a long, narrow steam box over a perpetual fire, feeding the planks into its humid belly until they were pliable. Then, working quickly before the wood cooled, he clamped them to the heavy oak form his father had designed. The strain was immense. Wood splintered, clamps failed. His hands became a geography of cuts, calluses, and deep, aching bruises. But one by one, the 14 ribs were completed, each a testament to patience. He set them in place, anchoring them to heavy sleepers bolted into the rock floor of the mine tunnel. The skeleton of the arch rose, a pale wooden whaleback deep within the earth's throat. It was 20 feet long and 12 feet wide, with an 8-foot clearance at its peak. Small, but enough. Once the frame was secure, he began the skin. He had salvaged 40 sheets of corrugated iron from the collapsed roof of an old stamp mill downriver. Hauling each sheet up the hill was a fresh agony. The metal was heavy, awkward, its edges sharp as razors. The wind caught them like sails, threatening to send him tumbling back down the slope. He moved with a slow, grinding persistence, one sheet at a time. Buster would watch from the mine entrance, whining softly whenever Elias stumbled. He drilled each hole by hand with a brace and bit, the screech of metal on metal echoing in the confined space. He riveted the sheets to the wooden ribs, the rhythmic tap, tap, tap of his hammer, a lonely drumbeat against the silence of the hills. He overlapped each sheet by 6 inches and sealed the seams with hot tar, a thick, acrid smell that clung to his clothes and hair. Days bled into weeks. The sun, a weak, distant disk, arced lower across the southern sky each day. The first snows came, light dustings that outlined the stark branches of the aspens and laid a thin blanket of white over the brown earth. They were beautiful and unsettling, a gentle warning of the power that lay coiled just over the horizon. With the outer shell complete, he started on the insulation, the most critical part of his father's design. The journal was explicit. The enemy is not the cold itself, but its insidious infiltration. A barrier of still air is the most effective defense. He built a second inner wall of rough-sawn pine planks, leaving a 4-inch gap between the inner wood and the outer iron. This cavity was the core of the shelter. He spent a week filling it. He hauled dozens of burlap sacks of sawdust from the lumber mill and mixed it with wool shoddy, the cast-off scraps from a distant textile factory that his father had ordered and stored years ago. The work was tedious, forcing the dense mixture into every crevice, packing it down with a long pole until the entire structure was encased in a thick, insulated blanket. His arms and shoulders ached with a deep, weary fire. He worked by lantern light late into the evenings, his world reduced to the small, arched space, the smell of pine and dust, and the soft breathing of his dog. The final piece of the interior was the stove. It was a small potbelly stove, bought for $2 from a widow leaving the territory. Its installation was the most complex part of the build. A bad flue would fill the airtight space with deadly smoke. His father's journal held the solution. He had surveyed the mine years before, noting a narrow, vertical fissure in the rock ceiling about 40 feet back from the entrance. It was a natural chimney. Elias spent 2 days carefully running a stovepipe from the back of his shelter up to this fissure, securing it with iron braces and sealing the connection with fire clay and rock. It was a gamble. If the fissure was blocked, the entire design was a failure. He laid a small fire of dry kindling and struck a match. The wood caught, and for a terrifying moment, a plume of smoke puffed back into the room. Buster, lying on a bed of straw Elias had made for him, lifted his head and sneezed. Elias held his breath. Then, with a soft whoosh, the draft caught. The smoke reversed its course, surging up the pipe and vanishing into the rock. A steady, clean draw was established. Heat began to radiate from the iron belly of the stove. Elias sank to his knees and held his raw hands out to the warmth. It was the first time he had felt truly warm in weeks. Buster padded over and curled up at his feet, letting out a contented sigh. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. This would work. The first week of December, he focused on provisions. He had a small cache of flour, beans, and salt pork his father had left, but it was not enough. He made several trips to Henderson's, buying what he could afford: more flour, coffee, sugar, kerosene for the lamps. Anna was always there. She no longer watched him with simple curiosity, but with a quiet, steady respect. She would wrap his purchases carefully, her hands brushing his as she passed him the parcels. "My father, he still doesn't understand," she said one afternoon, her voice barely a whisper. "He says you're like a badger, digging in for a winter you won't see the end of." "Badgers survive," Elias said simply. "Yes," she said, a small smile touching her lips. "They do." She slipped an extra bag of coffee into his sack. "For the cold nights," she whispered, before her father returned from the back room. He spent the rest of the month preparing fuel. He worked from dawn until dusk in the woods behind the mine, his axe ringing in the frozen air. He felled dead pines, bucked them into rounds, and split them until his hands were numb and his body trembled with exhaustion. He stacked the wood not outside, but deep inside the mine tunnel, behind his small shelter. He created a fortress of firewood, a massive reserve that would be dry and accessible no matter how deep the snow. He hunted, bringing down 2 deer, and spent days smoking the meat over a low hickory fire. The shelter began to feel like a home, a well-stocked ship ready to sail into the long, dark sea of winter. By early January of 1888, the landscape was locked in iron. The cold was a physical presence, a thing that cracked trees and turned a man's breath to instant frost. The old-timers in town grew quiet and watchful. They scanned the sky, a strange, milky white that offered no comfort. Jed found Elias checking the seal on his shelter door one afternoon. The older man's tone had lost some of its mockery, replaced now by a grudging curiosity. "Got that thing sealed up tight, I see," he said. "It's tight," Elias confirmed. "The wolves are coming down from the high country," Jed noted, stuffing his pipe. "Haven't seen that in years. The rabbits are all gone. Something's coming, boy. Something mean." I hope to God that little den of yours is as strong as you think it is." "It is," Elias said. The storm did not arrive with a roar. It began on the morning of January 12th with a deceptive gentleness. A soft, steady snowfall, the flakes fat and lazy. The temperature was unseasonably warm, hovering just below freezing. People in Providence went about their business, thinking it nothing more than another winter squall. But Elias, checking his father's barometer, saw the needle plunging at an alarming rate. He did one last walk around the mine entrance, securing a heavy canvas flap over the outer door of his shelter. He checked the flue, made sure the wood box was full to overflowing. He brought Buster inside and bolted the inner door, a thick, insulated plank construction. The world outside vanished. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire in the stove and the soft thud of Buster's tail against the straw bed. The air was warm and still. By noon, he could hear the wind beginning to pick up, a low moan that vibrated through the rock around them. By mid-afternoon, the moan had become a shriek. The fine, powdery snow, driven by winds that were now gusting to 60 miles per hour, began to force its way through invisible cracks in the mine's entrance, creating a fine, shimmering haze in the tunnel beyond his door. But inside the shelter, nothing stirred. The temperature held at a steady 65 degrees. The 4 inches of sawdust and wool were doing their work, defeating the wind's assault. Elias cooked a meal of venison stew and coffee. He ate slowly, listening to the muffled fury of the world outside. It was a terrifying, elemental sound, the sound of a planet trying to scour itself clean. Yet here, in this small pocket of warmth and calm he had carved from the earth, there was peace. He felt a profound sense of connection to his father, a quiet gratitude for the man's careful, methodical mind. He had not been a fool. He had been a prophet. Buster, sensing no alarm from his master, slept soundly, his paws twitching as he chased dream rabbits. The storm raged for the rest of that day and all through the night. The wind was a physical force, a constant, violent pressure. Elias imagined the town below, the flimsy wooden houses being battered and torn apart. He thought of Anna and her father. He banked the fire and tried to sleep, but the sound of the blizzard, even muted, was too immense. It was the sound of chaos. He sat in the dim lantern light, reading his father's journal, the words a comforting anchor in the storm. Sometime on the second day, he noticed the light from the small, thick-paned window he'd installed in the door was gone. He unbolted it and peered out. A solid wall of white pressed against the glass. The snow had completely buried the mine entrance. For the first time, a sliver of fear pierced his calm. They were entombed. He fought the panic down. The flue was his lifeline. He checked it obsessively. It was still drawing perfectly. The natural fissure high above the surface of the snow, catching the wind and pulling the smoke clear. They had air. They had warmth. They had food. They would be all right. He settled back into the routine of survival. Tend the fire, melt snow for water, eat, rest. He and Buster were a self-contained world, a tiny island of life in an ocean of frozen death. The storm was their whole reality. Then, late on the afternoon of the second day, a new sound intruded. It was faint at first, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from the very rock itself. Buster heard it too, lifting his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Elias pressed his ear to the iron wall. Thump, thump, thump. It was a desperate, failing beat, the sound of a fist against metal, transmitted through feet of compacted snow. Someone was out there. Adrenaline surged through him. He grabbed a shovel. Unbolting the door, he was met with a solid wall of snow, packed as hard as ice. He began to dig. It was like mining in reverse. The snow was dense, heavy, and he had to haul it back into his living space, piling it against the far wall. Buster barked, a frantic, encouraging sound. It took him nearly 20 minutes to carve a narrow tunnel through the drift that blocked his door. Finally, his shovel broke through into the main mine passage. A blast of frigid air hit him, and there, collapsed in the snow, was a figure. He dragged the man inside. It was Jed. His face was a mask of ice, his beard frozen solid. His clothes were stiff with snow. He was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. Elias stripped off the frozen outer layers, wrapped the old miner in every blanket he had, and propped him by the stove. He forced hot, sweet coffee between his cracked lips. For a long time, Jed could only shiver, a violent, uncontrollable shaking. Finally, his eyes focused. He looked around the small, warm space, at the sturdy, arched ribs, the glowing stove, the stacks of provisions. His gaze was one of utter astonishment. "My roof, it just went," he rasped, his voice a ghost of its former self. "The wind took it. I thought I was dead. I remembered the fool boy on the hill. I just crawled." He looked at Elias, and the old miner's eyes filled with tears. "Your father, he wasn't crazy." "No," Elias said, refilling his cup. "He was a planner." Jed's tracks, a desperate trench carved in the snow before the wind could erase it, became a lifeline. An hour later, more figures appeared at the mine entrance, drawn by the impossible sight of smoke rising from a fissure in the buried hillside. It was Mr. Henderson, his arm around his wife, with Anna trailing behind them. Their faces were etched with shock and grief. The large plate glass windows of the mercantile had exploded inward, and the wind had gutted the store and the apartment above it. They had huddled in the cellar until they saw Jed's trail. Elias brought them in. The small shelter was now crowded, but no one complained. The simple fact of warmth and safety was a miracle. Anna's eyes met his across the cramped space. She said nothing, but her look conveyed a world of gratitude and relief. Throughout the evening, more survivors stumbled to the mine, following the growing path. The family from the next claim over, their cabin flattened. 2 ranchers who had been caught on the road. By nightfall, 12 people and 1 dog were sheltered in Thorn's Folly, a small ark of humanity riding out the apocalypse. They shared Elias's food, drank his coffee, and listened to the storm spend the last of its fury. Their hushed, awe-struck voices, a testament to the quiet boy who had listened to his father. When the wind finally died on the 3rd morning, the silence was as profound as the noise had been. They dug their way out of the mine into a new world. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the sun shone on a landscape of impossible, sculptural white. Providence was gone, buried under drifts that were 15, 20 feet deep. Only the tallest rooftops were visible. The town was a graveyard of broken buildings and lost lives. The blizzard, they would later learn, had killed hundreds across the territory, a catastrophe of historic proportions. But on the hill, 12 survivors stood blinking in the sun, their lives owed to a structure built from salvaged iron and unconventional wisdom. Mr. Henderson walked over to Elias, his face haggard. The merchant's usual bluster was gone, replaced by a raw, humbled honesty. He put a hand on Elias's shoulder. "I was wrong, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was a fool. You saved my family. You saved all of us." He looked at the simple, arched entrance to the shelter, half buried in snow. "That isn't folly. That's genius." In the weeks that followed, as Providence dug itself out and counted its dead, the story of Thorn's Ark became a local legend. The shelter was no longer a source of mockery, but a subject of intense interest. People made the trek up the hill to see it, to run their hands over the cold iron, to peer into the warm, secure space within. They asked Elias questions, not with doubt, but with a desperate need to understand. How did he know? How had he built it? Quietly, patiently, Elias would open his father's journal and share the knowledge within. He spoke of insulation, of thermal mass, of proper ventilation. He wasn't boasting. He was teaching. He was honoring his father's legacy by giving it away. Time passed. The brutal winter of 1888 gave way to a green spring. The town rebuilt, but it rebuilt differently. The lessons of the blizzard had been learned in the cruelest way. That summer, Elias, with help from Jed and Mr. Henderson, built 2 more storm shelters based on his father's designs near the center of town. They were larger, meant for communal use, a permanent part of the town's infrastructure. Elias Thorne was no longer the quiet, strange boy on the hill. He was the man who had seen the storm coming when no one else would look. He and Anna were married the following autumn in a ceremony on the hill just outside the mine. The whole town was there. They built a proper house a few hundred yards away, a sturdy cabin of squared logs with a deep stone foundation. But the mine shelter, now known to everyone as the Storm Haven, was always maintained, its shelves stocked, its woodpile full. It was a monument and a promise. The years spooled out, measured in seasons of planting and harvest, of gentle snows and summer rains. Elias and Anna raised 2 sons and a daughter, children who grew up playing in the mine, treating the shelter as a magical cave. Elias became a member of the town council, his voice quiet but always listened to, his wisdom sought on everything from crop rotation to building codes. He never lost his habit of listening more than he spoke, of proving his worth through the work of his hands. Buster grew old. His muzzle turned gray, his steps became slow and deliberate. He spent most of his days sleeping by the hearth in the main house, his body a warm, familiar weight against Elias's boots. One cold evening, 15 years after the great blizzard, the old dog gave a soft sigh, laid his head in Elias's lap, and simply stopped. There was no struggle, no pain. It was a peaceful, quiet end to a long and loyal life. Elias carried the stiff, frail body up the hill and buried him in a spot overlooking the mine entrance, a place where the dog had spent countless hours watching him work. He carved a simple marker from a piece of weathered oak. Buster, a good dog. The grief was a quiet, heavy stone in his chest. He had lost his first and most faithful believer. The world turned. The century changed. Elias's hair turned the color of winter frost. He walked with a slight stoop, the legacy of a lifetime of hard labor, but his eyes were still clear and observant. He taught his grandchildren how to read the sky, how to bank a fire, how to listen to the wisdom of the earth. He filled new journals with his own observations, adding to the knowledge his father had left him. The town of Providence thrived, known throughout the territory as a place that was prepared, a community that had learned to respect the raw power of the land. Elias died in his sleep one night in the autumn of 1938, a full half-century after the storm that had defined his life. He was an old man, full of years and respect. The entire town, and people from settlements miles around, came to his funeral. They buried him on the hill, next to the small, weathered marker for his dog. His son, a skilled stonemason, carved his gravestone from a piece of local granite. It didn't list dates or accomplishments in the traditional way. It read, Elias Thorne, He listened to the earth and built for the wind. He gave us shelter. Decades melted into decades. The town modernized. Cars replaced wagons, and power lines stitched the landscape. But the hill remained largely unchanged. The mine entrance was eventually fenced off for safety, but it was never sealed. It was preserved as a historical site. Through the fence you could still see it, the rust-streaked corrugated iron arch of the shelter, nestled just inside the dark opening. It was small, unassuming, and indomitable. One crisp, clear afternoon, a young woman brought her son to the hill. They were new to the area, and she was telling him the old stories. They stood at the fence, looking at the strange iron structure. "A man built that, a long, long time ago," she said. "Before a terrible storm, everyone thought he was crazy, but he saved a dozen people inside that little house." The boy, no older than 10, squinted at the shelter. "It looks really strong," he said. "It is," his mother replied, a sense of wonder in her own voice. "Some things are built to last." They stood there for a long time, the wind whispering through the tall prairie grass. The sun glinted off the curved iron roof. The structure stood. It endured. It was a quiet testament, a silent lesson in the enduring power of one man's stubborn, loving foresight. It was his home.